The courtroom was eerily silent. The atmosphere was heavy and tense. Everyone present in the room held their breath, their eyes fixed on the chair where the little girl, Mary, only 6 years old, sat. She had long, straight hair cascading down her shoulders, and that innocent face no longer held the radiant light it once did. Her clear blue eyes showed no emotion, just an empty space filled with pain. She did not speak, did not move, and no one dared to touch her. Sitting next to Mary was a very special companion, Jack, a hunting dog with sleek black fur and sharp, intelligent eyes. Jack was no ordinary dog. He was a service dog, specially trained to be a companion for children who had experienced deep trauma. Mary and Jack shared an inseparable bond. It was Jack who was the only one Mary trusted, the one who made her feel love and safety. All the eyes in the courtroom were focused on Mary and her dog. They were the only witnesses in a kidnapping trial taking place. James Nolan, a man with a cold, indifferent face, stood in the defendant's box, his hands tightly clasped on the table. He did not look at Mary, nor did he look at Jack, but his gaze kept darting around the room, as if feeling something heavy pressing down on him. The story began a few months ago when Mary was kidnapped. The details were hazy for her, but one thing was certain. James Nolan was the one who had put her into the black van when she was playing alone in a nearby park. But there was one strange fact. Mary could not remember the face of the kidnapper. She only remembered the feelings of fear, pain, and the warm tears, but not the face of the enemy. There was no physical evidence, no clear testimony. James Nolan had denied all charges, and his lawyer was trying to create a loophole in the case. He had nothing to fear. The police had found no fingerprints or DNA at the scene, and this made everything uncertain. But there was one thing that couldn't be denied: Mary's silence. No words, no gestures. She remained silent, watching, with only Jack by her side, his sharp eyes scanning every movement in the room. Suddenly, as the courtroom grew more tense, a breeze passed through, causing the window to creak. Jack, the skilled hunting dog, lifted his head abruptly, his gaze fixed on James Nolan. His actions were unlike any normal dog. Jack's ears stood up, and the fur on his body began to bristle. He let out a low growl, as if warning of a looming danger. No one in the room understood why Jack had reacted this way. Even Mary, with her unblinking stare, looked intently at James Nolan. It wasn't the innocent gaze of a child, but one filled with awareness, a hidden fear. At that moment, a huge question arose in the prosecutor's mind. Were Mary and Jack holding a truth that they could not express? The courtroom grew more tense by the minute. James Nolan's lawyer confidently asserted that nothing could convict his client. Everything was just a coincidence. The evidence of the kidnapping was merely unsubstantiated speculation. But why had Jack reacted like this? How could a dog recognize a person that no one else could identify? When the prosecutor stood up, her gaze fixed on Mary and Jack, trying to uncover the key point. "Can we trust a 6-year-old?" she asked, but not to get an answer, but to provoke a thought in the minds of everyone in the room. This was a case not only full of mystery, but also full of doubt. In this heavy atmosphere, the clues could only be discovered through the inexplicable reactions of a hunting dog and a child who had lost her voice. The courtroom was no longer just trying one man. It was facing a bigger challenge, a battle of wits between human logic and the intangible instincts of an animal. Could Mary help solve this mystery? Could Jack reveal the truths that humans could not see? The answer would slowly begin to unfold in the tense moments to come. Mary sat silently in the living room, her eyes following the windows where the faint rays of the afternoon sun filtered through the curtains. Everything around her was quiet, as if time had stopped. But in that silence, there was one sound that Mary could hear most clearly: the footsteps of Jack. The sleek black hunting dog walked around the room, each step gentle, like a loyal companion ready to protect her from any threat. Jack was not just a dog. He was a part of Mary's life, the only friend who could offer her comfort. They had been bonded since Mary was very young, and their connection went beyond play or sharing ordinary moments. After the horrific kidnapping, Jack became an incredibly important companion in Mary's life. A few months ago, Mary lost her ability to speak. The psychological shock from the kidnapping was so intense that the girl could no longer utter a word. Despite everyone's efforts to comfort her, no one could truly understand what she had gone through. Only Jack, the dog Mary had always loved, was the one who could help her feel peaceful. In the days following her rescue, Jack became the only bridge between Mary and the outside world. Whenever she wanted to speak but could not, Jack would stay close to her, wagging his tail, as if saying, "It is okay, Mary, we are still together." Mary could not speak, but she understood everything through Jack's warm gaze and gentle movements. At night, when Mary curled up in bed, Jack would always lie next to her, his bright eyes shining in the darkness. If Mary had nightmares, the dog would immediately stand up, lean down on the bed, silently guarding her. Each time Mary felt safer, and gradually her fears started to subside. But strangely, although she could not speak, Mary could sense the things Jack was thinking. She knew when Jack was tense or worried, and sometimes just one glance from the dog would make her understand what was going on. Jack was not just an ordinary service dog. He was like a close friend, capable of understanding Mary's emotions and conveying the feelings she could not express in words. One day, Mary was sitting next to Jack in the park near their home, both of them watching the sunset. The girl absent-mindedly played with Jack's collar, and suddenly, tears fell from her eyes. Jack, who had grown accustomed to Mary's tears, leaned forward and placed his head on her lap, looking up at her with his deep eyes. Mary smiled, gently stroking the dog's back. "I will be okay, Jack," she whispered. But at that moment, Mary did not expect something terrifying to happen. Jack began to act uneasy. He no longer lay still but kept looking around, his ears perked up, his eyes focusing on a figure in the distance. This feeling made Mary worried. The dog had never reacted like this before, and what Jack was sensing, Mary began to realize that something was wrong. A few minutes later, a man walked closer to them. Mary could not see his face clearly, but Jack's change in behavior immediately made the girl feel something was wrong. The dog let out a low growl, full of threat, which made the man stop for a moment. Mary tightly gripped Jack's leash, her small hands trembling. "This dog is not normal," the man said quietly, his eyes flashing with unease. Mary couldn't say anything, but she could feel that he was no ordinary stranger. There was something shady and dangerous about him, and Jack's behavior change was the only sign she could recognize. A cold sensation crept over her as the man drew closer, but fortunately Jack did not leave her side. The dog stepped forward, standing in front of her, eyes locked on the stranger. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped back, his hands starting to sweat. When he turned to leave, Mary still felt the unease hanging in the air. Jack knew something that the girl couldn't fully understand. Although she couldn't speak, Mary knew Jack was a wonderful friend, and whenever she needed him, Jack was always ready to protect her. But from that moment on, she began to realize that the kidnapping case was far from over. There was something deeper than she had imagined, and perhaps only Jack could help her solve that mystery. The trial had been ongoing for several weeks, and everything was becoming more tense than ever. The atmosphere in the courtroom was so heavy that no one could breathe. The entire courtroom was silent, all eyes fixed on Mary, the 6-year-old girl, the only one who could shed light on the kidnapping case. However, Mary could not speak. Whenever she was asked about the events of the kidnapping, the girl could only lower her head, her small hands tightly gripping Jack, who sat by her side. Jack, the loyal hunting dog trained to assist those with psychological trauma, was Mary's only companion and the only one who understood what she felt. Yet, even with Jack by her side, Mary couldn't make a sound. For her, language was a foreign, incomprehensible world, a world she could not reach. Everyone in the courtroom focused on her, but Mary only knew how to lower her head, gently stroking the sleek black fur of Jack. The feeling of helplessness inside her grew stronger as the evidence suggested that James Nolan had no clear traces to convict him. There were no DNA samples, no physical evidence linking him to Mary or anyone else involved. The case seemed on the verge of fading into obscurity. However, James Nolan's lawyer kept trying to undermine Mary's testimony. Every question he asked targeted Mary's inability to communicate in an effort to discredit the only testimony from the prosecution. They argued that without speech and without clear evidence, everything was just a delusion. They began to make everyone in the courtroom doubt. The defendant's lawyer seemed relentless. He argued that this case was just a misunderstanding. This girl, no matter what she can prove, has no concrete evidence to convict James Nolan. She hasn't spoken a word. How can we trust something she cannot share? These were his words during the defense. Mary felt a coldness seep into her body. She didn't know how to react. Jack, the only dog who had always been by her side, looked at her with a determined gaze. She gripped Jack's leash tightly, as if to reassure herself. But then, something strange happened during the next interrogation. In the stillness of the courtroom, Jack suddenly became uneasy. The dog's once steady footsteps became anxious, constantly observing its surroundings. The dog took a step back, then suddenly turned its head toward James Nolan. Everyone in the courtroom fell silent, their eyes following the dog's every movement. Jack stopped in front of the defendant's table, its bright eyes fixed on James Nolan. The tension in the room escalated dramatically. The dog let out a low growl, but this growl was different from any other. It sounded like a warning, a sign that only the perceptive could notice. James Nolan's lawyer tried to ease the atmosphere by saying, "This dog must be acting up because of its training." But let us not forget, we are prosecuting a human, not an animal. However, prosecutor Anna Collins did not overlook Jack's strange behavior. She felt that something serious was happening. Suddenly, she stood up and demanded that the defendant, James Nolan, face the dog. James Nolan, the prosecutor, began, "Face the truth. This dog is reacting distinctly to you. Every action it takes has a reason. You can try to deny it, but it will not lie to us." Everyone's gaze turned back to James Nolan, who had begun to sweat heavily. The calm demeanor he had always tried to maintain was now starting to crack. He swallowed nervously, his hands starting to tremble. "This can't be," he mumbled, trying to justify himself. At that moment, the unspoken truths erupted. In the courtroom, no one could ignore the strangeness of Jack. The dog stood upright, its eyes fixed on James Nolan, and it growled more loudly, as if demanding that the man face his crimes. This scene made the entire courtroom feel suffocating. Mary's gaze had not left Jack's side from the beginning. She could feel the worry in the dog's body, but she also knew that Jack was helping her find justice. Could Jack become the silent witness who reveals the truth? Or would justice be obscured by the lawyer's defenses? Everyone was waiting for the next developments, as every passing minute intensified the palpable tension in the courtroom. The story was far from over. Everything was just beginning. The trial continued in the courtroom, and each day passed, with the parties involved growing tired and desperate. James Nolan remained cold and detached, but a vague sense of tension hung over everyone present. Even though there was no clear physical evidence and Mary couldn't provide testimony due to her muteness, everyone could sense that this case wasn't going to end easily. Prosecutor Anna Collins persisted, refusing to give up. She decided to request a new search, one more attempt to investigate places where James Nolan had lived before being arrested. She felt that if the abandoned house Nolan once lived in could be found, there might be some evidence that had been overlooked. With the court's approval, a special investigation team was dispatched. They searched through a desolate forest where James Nolan had lived for some time before abruptly leaving the area after suspicion was raised. The police couldn't help but feel uneasy as they entered the area, not only because it was so remote, but also because there was an eerie atmosphere in the air. But what they discovered next made everyone shiver. An abandoned house, hidden amidst decaying trees and waist-high weeds. Was this the place James Nolan had lived? Or was it just a temporary shelter for unspeakable crimes? The investigation team decided to enter the house. The old, worn wooden door creaked loudly as it was pushed open. Inside, the space was dark, cold, dusty, and filled with old furniture. A filthy rug lay on the floor, damaged paintings were discarded, and children's items appeared to have been cruelly abandoned. Toys, old clothes, and the belongings of a child, everything was here. The police began searching every corner of the house, and the truth suddenly came to light when they discovered a small window leading down to a neglected basement. As they descended into the basement, the investigators felt the heavy atmosphere grow even more mysterious. Then they found a small, damp, and dark room. Jack the dog, still closely following the investigation team, began to show unusual reactions. It started growling. Its steps became quick and hurried. Jack seemed to sense something in this place that no one else could understand. It charged into the small room in the basement, shaking its head and growling continuously. Then, the dog stopped in front of a corner of the wall. The investigation team started examining more closely and discovered a crude chain hidden under layers of dirt and dust. A cold sensation emanated from there. The police quickly handled the situation, and when they pulled the chain up, they were left speechless upon discovering a child being imprisoned. The child was frail, with a thin, fragile body, her eyes filled with panic and fear. It was immediately clear this was Lily, a child who had been missing for many months. Lily, a child who had been reported missing long ago, was now lying in this dark room, chained and dragged out like an animal. She seemed too weak to even stand. This discovery hit the investigation team like a bomb. Not only Mary, but also another innocent child had suffered because of James Nolan's actions. Jack stepped back, growling softly, as if to protect Lily and those rescuing her. The investigation team quickly called for an ambulance and took Lily away immediately, but they could not help but feel a deep sadness rising within them. The evidence found in the abandoned house not only proved Lily's existence, but also strengthened suspicions about James Nolan. The courtroom was no longer just a place for debating a single kidnapping case. It had now transformed into a place revealing horrifying truths. The police collected additional DNA samples from the chain where Lily had been tied, and this became the key to bringing the case closer to the truth. James Nolan was no longer just a suspect in Mary's kidnapping. He could also be the kidnapper of many other children. Never before had the suspicions in this case been so clear. Now, it was not only Mary who was a victim of James Nolan. Everything was slowly unfolding, and the secrets he had desperately tried to conceal were being exposed to the light. Would this evidence be strong enough to convict him? And could Jack the dog help uncover all of James Nolan's crimes once and for all? Everyone was waiting for the next developments. The trial continued under a tense atmosphere, with the pressure growing heavier on everyone present. Although James Nolan continued to deny all charges, the previous evidence was not strong enough to make him concede. Mary, the only witness in the case, remained silent, unable to communicate. Every time she tried to speak, only meaningless sounds came out, as if halting before the cruelty she had to face. However, something was changing in the atmosphere of the courtroom. Prosecutor Anna Collins had not given up. She knew that even a small breakthrough could change everything. New evidence was slowly being gathered and presented in court. Anna, with her iron determination, was preparing to embark on an audacious strategy. After the search in the desolate forest and James Nolan's house, the police had gathered a series of valuable pieces of evidence. Not only were there children's toys and belongings, but they also found DNA traces of James Nolan on a chain that Lily had been tied with in the dark room. This DNA could not be coincidental. It was clear he had been at the abandoned house where Lily had been imprisoned. This was irrefutable, concrete evidence. When this information was presented in court, the atmosphere grew incredibly heavy. All eyes were on James Nolan. Both the defense and prosecution looked at each other, waiting for the result from this evidence. Silence filled the room. For the first time, James Nolan appeared to be panicking. He kept glancing at the evidence, then furtively looking at Jack, the strange hunting dog of Mary. Just then, Jack began to act in a very unusual manner. The dog stood up from its spot, its eyes fixed on the defendant. Its head was raised high, its body tense, and low growls echoed, as though it wanted to tear the air apart. These weren't ordinary growls, they were filled with anger, resentment. This action could not have been accidental. In a moment, everyone in the courtroom felt the presence of something terrifying. Jack's eyes never left James Nolan, and that was the moment everyone realized that the dog knew something that they hadn't fully understood. The tension in the room reached its peak. Jack's appearance, along with the new evidence, sparked doubts in everyone's mind. From then on, the traces of James Nolan's crimes were no longer just rumors, but undeniable facts. Everyone in the courtroom could see that James Nolan was growing more and more panicked. He was not only facing powerful legal evidence, but also something he could not explain: the presence of Jack, the mysterious dog. As he was called to testify, the tension in the courtroom became almost suffocating. Jack kept growling and moving towards him, not just acting as a protector of Mary, but also as a clear sign that he was identifying the criminal. James Nolan's gaze turned to Jack, and an unmistakable fear appeared in his eyes. It was a fear not because the dog was a fierce beast, but because he knew Jack was not just a dog. It was a living memory of everything he had done. He realized that this dog had seen him at his darkest moments when he committed his crimes. Suddenly, in a moment of suffocating silence, James Nolan lowered his head, his shoulders trembling. The entire courtroom held its breath. "All right, I did it, he whispered, his voice so low it was almost inaudible. But everyone heard it clearly, the confession of his crimes. James Nolan lowered his head and confessed to all his wrongdoings. "Jack, I remember that dog," he said, unable to look directly at Jack. "I remember when it looked at me, when I threatened it. It saw me do all those things. I'm afraid of it. I am afraid, to the point of madness." The entire courtroom fell silent. His confession felt like a powerful slap, not only to justice, but also to all the victims he had caused pain. But that was not the end. The fear in his eyes made everyone present ponder something deeper. Was he truly afraid of the dog, or was he afraid of the very crimes he had committed? With this confession, there was no longer any doubt. The case had entered a new chapter. But the only remaining question was, would justice truly be served when all the truths were revealed? The scene in the courtroom now felt like a still painting, yet filled with the taste of tension. All eyes were fixed on James Nolan. After the new evidence was presented, he could no longer escape. But instead of the confident attitude he once had, he now appeared panicked, as though his entire body was tense, standing on a fragile line between freedom and punishment. Prosecutor Anna Collins stood at the desk, facing James, her eyes gleaming with determination. "James Nolan, have you heard these pieces of evidence? You can no longer deny it. Your DNA has been found in the very place where you held an innocent child captive. You not only harmed Mary, but also Lily, and possibly other children. Admit it, James. Admit it." But James did not answer. He only lowered his head, his hands tightly gripping the table in front of him. His fingers trembled and sweat began to bead on his forehead. Everyone in the courtroom noticed the strange shift in the defendant's demeanor. His initial confidence had completely disappeared. His gaze suddenly flicked to Jack, the hunting dog lying quietly next to Mary. But there was something strange in that glance. Fear began to rise within him, as though the darkness of his past suddenly rushed back. Although he said nothing, his eyes, full of worry and terror, made the courtroom feel even more suffocating. Jack, the dog, still lying quietly next to Mary, suddenly stood up. Its steps were light, but there was a strange power in every move. Its eyes never left James, and in the air an invisible tension began to slowly envelop the room. A low growl, initially just a whisper from the dog, gradually became clearer, stronger, and filled with anger. The entire courtroom immediately sensed that something was wrong. Jack, once thought to be calm, now showed its full fury. It took a step toward James Nolan. Its steps were steady, confident, and powerful, as if Jack was leading the way, not just for Mary, but for everything that needed to be exposed. James dared not face the dog directly. He turned his face away, his body trembling, sweat soaking his shirt. He knew this dog knew everything. He couldn't escape its judgment. At that moment, an odd look from Jack caught everyone off guard. The dog stared at James Nolan, not only with a watchful gaze, but with a commanding recognition. It was recognizing something that only it and James understood. And then, as James began to show clear signs of panic, all the tension in the room seemed to build, waiting for a turning point. Immediately, Prosecutor Anna Collins stepped forward and quietly said, "James Nolan, you have faced Jack before, have you not? You have seen its gaze before, have you not?" The entire courtroom fell silent, no one daring to breathe loudly. Everyone's gaze was fixed on the defendant, who slowly lowered his head as though his fear had reached its peak. James Nolan could no longer hold back. Stories from the past, his memories of the dog, the dark nights, the times he faced Jack's gaze in fear and panic, began to flood back. "The first time I saw it, I was terrified. I was scared out of my mind. It looked at me as if it wanted to tear me apart. I can't explain it, but it knew me. It knew everything I had done," he whispered, his voice low, as if trying to hide the fear rising within him. In the courtroom, no one dared to move. Only Jack's low growl echoed, confirming that everything James Nolan said was the truth. He wasn't just afraid of punishment from humans, but of his own actions, the haunting memories he could not erase. And then, under the pressure of the evidence and the threat not only from the law, but also from a dog, James Nolan could no longer endure. "I did it. I kidnapped the children. I hurt them. I took Mary. I threatened the dog. But I couldn't escape it." His voice rang with desperation, and for the first time, James Nolan completely broke down under judgment. The dog, Jack, had forced him to face the crimes he had hidden, and his own fear, from the depths of his conscience, made him confess. And when he confessed to his crimes, the entire courtroom erupted in a mix of tension and shock. James Nolan was sentenced, not only through evidence, but also by confronting the very fears from his own deeds. But all of this was just the beginning, as the trial would continue, yet at this moment, justice had been served, and Jack the loyal hunting dog had helped bring forth a truth no one could deny. The court session ended, but the atmosphere in the courtroom still lingered, like a storm that had just passed. James Nolan was sentenced to life imprisonment with no chance of release, but no one in the courtroom could breathe a sigh of relief just yet. Although justice had been served, the price for it had been steep. After the trial, Mary sat quietly in her chair. She was no longer the joyful, carefree child she once was. What she had gone through, the things that had been taken from her, could not be easily healed by a verdict. But in Mary's eyes, something had changed. It was no longer an invisible fear, but a newfound resilience. She looked at Jack, the hunting dog still by her side, its head gently resting on her feet, its eyes warm and understanding. Mary didn't say anything, but in the silence, she felt the strength from her dog. A sense of peace, even if only temporary, crept into her heart. She no longer felt alone. Though she couldn't express it in words, it seemed as though the dog could read her soul. Jack was the only friend who never judged, never left her, no matter what. The trial had ended, but Mary and Jack's life continued. Step by step, they walked out of the courthouse, back into the world Mary had once avoided. Everything outside seemed to remain the same, but for Mary, the space had changed. She was no longer just the silent girl, haunted by painful memories, but a child who had conquered her fears and was stepping into a new life. In the weeks that followed, Mary and Jack faced many challenges together. Each day, Mary gradually regained the confidence she had lost. She began attending therapy sessions where she learned to communicate again. People around her were amazed at her progress, but Mary knew that all of it was because of Jack's presence. The dog was the only bridge between her and the outside world, a source of encouragement and an invisible protector that helped her slowly rediscover the light in her eyes. One afternoon, as she sat by the window gazing at the outside world, Mary suddenly turned to Jack, gently holding her beloved dog's face. In that moment, for the first time in many months, she spoke, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "Thank you, Jack." Those were the first words she had spoken since the trial, but they were also the most meaningful words of her life. In that moment, Mary wasn't just thanking the dog for staying by her side all this time. She was thanking Jack for everything it had helped her overcome. It wasn't just an animal, It was a loyal friend, a protector she could trust. The psychological scars Mary carried would take time to heal, but with Jack by her side, she knew she could overcome anything. Mary's life continued, and Jack remained her irreplaceable friend. She might never forget what had happened, but there was one thing she knew for sure. Mary would never be alone again. Jack would always be by her side, not just as a protector, but as a part of her life, a part of her heart. With each passing day, Mary slowly returned to the simple joys of childhood. She participated in school, played with her friends, and gradually found laughter again within herself. Although Jack couldn't speak, in its eyes always shone a deep understanding, as if it knew everything would be all right. One beautiful morning, as Mary and Jack were walking in the park, Mary looked up at the sky, and for the first time in many months, she felt free. The feeling of no longer being imprisoned by painful memories. The feeling that there was still beauty ahead in life. And she knew that no matter what happened, Jack would always be her most loyal friend, the protector she could trust. In the end, Mary had found peace in her soul, not just because the trial had ended, but because she had learned how to stand firm on her own 2 feet. She had not only regained her confidence, but she had also found a friend who would never leave her, Jack, the loyal companion, the most reliable protector in her life. "Thank you, Jack," she whispered, holding her beloved dog's face. And although no more words were necessary, they both knew that their friendship would never change. Jack would always be the friend, the protector, that Mary could rely on, not just in the difficult moments, but throughout her entire life. Thank you all for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss out on the best stories. See you in the next one.